What is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act? This legislation was passed in 1990, and very recently it had a major change that is affecting lots of Native communities and museums that hold Native artifacts and items of cultural patrimony. You know, from the 1800s on, there was a long period of time in which Native people were really being disempowered and objectified by the American public and the government. So at the time of conflict and the establishment of reservations, there were a lot of Native people who had their sacred items taken away, sometimes by Indian agents, sometimes by missionaries, and a lot of those items ended up in museums. Some run by the U.S. government, others run, by private entities, and a lot of private collectors. In addition to that, there were times when the U.S. Army took the bodies of dead Native people and had them macerated, which means to be boiled, and then had the bones put on display. To this date, the Smithsonian Institution still keeps probably a couple 100,000 Native skeletons. There have been many repatriated. At one point, it was probably as high as 300,000. And some of the issues included just control of our own bodies and the bodies of our loved ones that were buried. And another concern were items that were really culturally significant and necessary for running ceremonies or things like that. And so the legislation was passed in 1990, which said that museums need to notify the Native stakeholders about any items that are either funerary, related to death and funerals, or of significant cultural patrimony, sacred items. And then there would be a process by which tribes could ask for them back and museums would repatriate them. Some significant things did happen. There were some high-profile repatriations, both of sacred items and of human remains to tribes. However, the legislation didn't really punish anyone who did not comply with the legislation. And a lot of things were held by private collectors, not just public museums. And so very recently, just months ago, there was a big change in the legislation, which really stiffened the penalties for museums and required a higher level of transparency. And that stirred up a lot of recent activity around the repatriation of Native sacred items in particular. And so I do think this has been a positive change. Bear in mind, it's not always super simple. So the process says, that any relevant tribe will be notified, but sometimes more than one tribe might have a claim to a particular item, or there might be funerary remains that it's not clear which particular tribe they belong to, because in some areas tribes moved around, or depending on the timing of the burial, it could have been a different group. So it's not always super simple, but I think it's important that museums and collectors don't hide behind that information to slow down, slow walk, or obstruct the return of items. I've been a part of a number of repatriations, both, representing Native communities. For example, at White Earth, we actually had all of the ceremonial drums taken out of that entire reservation. And there were a couple of repatriations. One actually came from a church that was holding a ceremonial drum, and a couple of other ones that were from museums. And it had been decades since we had had a drum ceremony at White Earth. And it had been so long that a lot of people didn't know the protocols for doing those ceremonies. But our neighbors in Mille Lacs, next reservation over had a lot of people who were actively running these ceremonial drums. So the people at White Earth started to apprentice to and learn from the folks in Mille Lacs, got the drums repatriated, and reinvigorated ceremonial drum culture in White Earth. That ceremony can only be done with the original sacred items that come from that place, or by the creation of a new one that has a piece from the original. So with everything locked up in museums, it was impossible to do that ceremony. And there have been many other high-profile repatriations. I talked about some in a different video. And ultimately, I think the change in the law is really good. I think it could use further refinement. And I've also been involved with repatriations in a very different way. So I currently sit on the governing board for the Minnesota Historical Society, and that agency has been repatriating items of cultural significance. For example, there's a big Chilkat robe, which are really important in Tlingit culture and for some of the other neighboring tribes. And so that's really been impressive to see the organization leaning into and doing its part of that process. I'd say that the process still feels slow for everybody on all sides, but it's the due diligence and waiting periods and notification of multiple tribes to make sure that the repatriation's being done according to the law that often slows those things down. But I do think that there's an interest on behalf of many museums to do the right thing and cultivate positive relationships with Native stakeholders and things like that. There are some who resist for a whole variety of reasons. And I do think there's still an effort to objectify Native people, not just our, items in museums, but the people themselves. And so I'm hopeful that, the shifts in the law and the shift in practice amongst people who are involved in this sort of thing will result in a lot more good work being done and the healing that can come from that. Miigwech.